Welcome, Dr. Frank Furedi, Executive Director at the think tank MCC Brussels.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Welcome to RIX Europe. Now, you have these 5 takeaways from the Trump election that Europe needs to pay special attention to, that you presented at an event that your think tank MCC Brussels hosted. Can you tell us a little briefly about what these 5 main takeaways are?
Well, I think the most important one that I felt was quite unique was the fact that this wasn't just an ordinary election, because this time around the Republicans weren't merely a party, but there was a grassroots movement behind them. And one of the things that I noticed talking to people who are fairly busy and active in the States, they all tell me that the people that have united to back Trump are really not just individual voters who focus everything, all their dreams on one individual, which is Donald Trump, but they also have a common view of the world, and they kind of really see each other as part of a movement, something bigger than just a single individual. And I thought that was really quite important, and what actually is responsible for the election triumph of the Republicans. I think that was really quite important, and that was the first important takeaway message for me. I think the second takeaway message that was really interesting is that it shows 2 things. It shows you how the legacy media is really out of touch with society. I mean, if you talk to them, if you see the issues they think are important, their focus on different news matters is very different to that of ordinary people, and they seem to be so out of touch that they're becoming less relevant. But the other side of this is that a lot of people have drawn the conclusion that they're not going to watch them anymore. And a lot of the alternative media, the podcasts, are really much more important. And I think one of the reasons why Trump won was because he focused on this alternative media, and he used that as a way of making an appeal. So that means there's a new media landscape that's kind of gradually emerging, which ought to give hope to everybody, because it basically means that if we can create a new media that is independent of the dominant mainstream one, then we can communicate with the public in a way that hasn't been really possible for a very, very, very long time. So that's my kind of second takeaway. I also thought something that was really quite important for me is that for the first time in my life, and I'm a really old guy, I've seen that identity politics has experienced a major setback. Usually identity politics goes from strength to strength ever since the 1980s. But the very fact that despite the appeal of Kamala Harris to black people, to women, to Hispanic people, despite that real focus on mobilizing that identity constituency, nevertheless, large numbers of these groups voted for Trump, particularly the Hispanic community, where you had a very large increase in the number of Spanish-speaking voters opting to go for the Republicans. And to me, that was really special and indicates that it's possible, perhaps, to break down the ascendant, the hegemony that identity politics experiences at the moment. So that, I think, is really important. And, for people, like you in Sweden or in France or in Holland, this is something that you got to think about if there's a way of replicating that sort of triumph. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to have multiculturalism acting as a barrier to the development of more patriotic kind of movements. The other takeaway that was, to me, really quite significant was the fact that the elite, the mainstream political establishment, the mainstream elites, are likely to become quite hysterical as against this reaction. And that hysteria, we experienced in Britain, where after Brexit, they just basically they basically blamed everybody other than themselves. And to this day, they're continually going on about what a big problem this is. The people had betrayed them. They all, the way they talk about the voters who don't support them is almost as if they are enemies rather than political opponents. And that kind of hysteria, I think, is going to be really quite important. And you can already sense that on the election night, the way that the media personalities just broke down In England, I'm in England for a few days. The Guardian newspaper is offering counseling and therapy to its journalists. It's on, it actually it reports that as a service, and it tells its journalists to phone up an American journalist and comfort them and give them support. That kind of infantilized sort of way of behaving, when it mixes together with their hysterical sort of orientation, is going to have a very unpredictable effect. So these are the kind of things that I thought were really quite important, and we have to dig a little bit deeper to understand, because the significance of this election is not just confined to America. It's going to be really, really important for us here in Europe.
So you mentioned this about the Republican Party essentially becoming this sort of grassroots movement thanks to Trump. But do you think, what happens after Trump? Is there a successor to Trump? Will someone actually be able to carry this grassroots movement further? Or what will happen to the Republican Party when Trump is no longer able to run for president?
Yeah. So I think it's a really open question, because there are no guarantees about the durability of any kind of movement. And we've known in the past that there's been grass movements that had staying power, others that kind of quickly fizzled out. I think that a lot depends on the quality of leadership, and the quality of leadership is important because they can either reinforce the self-confidence of this movement or create cynicism and skepticism. I happen to think that we're kind of, to some extent, blessed by the fact that J.D. Vance, the vice president, has got a lot of potential. He's a relatively smart guy. He's quite intelligent. He's quite personable. He's got some really good leadership qualities. And hopefully he can mature into a proper leader and maybe even develop a degree of charisma, which he already has a bit of. But, if that happens, then it will mean that there's a kind of continuity to the existing legacy. But the big problem that Trump will face and the movement will face is that the way that the American Constitution works and the way that the institutions of government work, you literally have tens of thousands of people in Washington who are really hostile to this project and are going to do everything possible to thwart the ambition that the Trump administration will have. And I just hope that, to some extent, they have prepared for this. I know that in Washington, D.C., some Republicans have already begun to mobilize people for different positions in government. And this has been going on now for at least a couple of years. And they're going to need that, because when Trump was elected last time, they really had nobody that they could rely on in the State Department, defense, any of the state institutions. And that is something that you need to anticipate. Any political party in Europe will have the same kind of problem, and they will already have to begin to ask the question, how are they going to mobilize the core of people together to ensure that the government can be effective?
You also mentioned that the election marks a sort of setback for at least left-wing identity politics, but some would probably argue that Donald Trump and nationalists also in Europe are somewhat appealing to nativism. Like it's a sort of in-group preference, a sort of in-group identity politics. Or would you not call what Donald Trump is doing with regards, or what any other type of nationalist leader is doing, is that not identity politics? Or how do you resonate around that topic?
Well, I think that we have to remember that national identity, the sense of patriotism, sort of anticipates and pre-exists before the politicization of identity. It's a different kind of phenomenon, because in a sense, one of the distinguishing features of European patriotism historically is a certain pride in the nation, a certain future-oriented vision of this is what the nation will look like. It is the very opposite to identity politics, which is typically about being a victim. It's about being put upon. It's about being sorry for yourself. And if you look at the way that identity political movements work today, where it's Black Lives Matters or the LGBTQ movements, they haven't got a future orientation. They basically want to, they want to get a compensation for the past. They want to sort of somehow exact revenge on what happened beforehand. So although the identity is involved in all cases, in one case it's not really a politicized phenomenon. It's not the main motive uh, for um, for political activity. In the other case, it's entirely who you are that becomes the be all and the end all of your vision. And I think it's wrong to basically say, oh yeah, the right wing is just as much involved in identity politics as the left. Now, obviously, there are sections of the right who play the victim card, which I don't particularly like when they also feel sorry for themselves. So I get really angry when I hear American professors, university professors, or Americans saying, "Oh, they're so bad to us in the universities. You know, they don't like conservatives." Well, you know, I say tough. You know, if you have a hard time, then learn to, you know, kind of grow some courage and learn to fight back. But I really don't like this. You know, when the right wing, you know, sort of imitates left-wing victim politics, because that's really unworthy, and it loses your moral authority if you do something like that.
So what do you think the left wing will do, and what will the media do? I mean, will they cease appealing to this identity politics? Will they cease calling the right wing racist or fascist, or how do you think they will cope?
I think it will be a combination of pragmatism, because these are big businesses as well, and they know that, you know, their audience is fairly confined. Now. There's a big audience that is not sympathetic to that constant whining. I think they're going to be fairly pragmatic about it, but at the same time, they still, you know, for them, this is like a catastrophe, and that's the way they experience it. Yeah, I don't know if you have American friends, but when you talk to Americans who are against Trump, they are so invested in the rhetoric of fascism, you know, coming to Washington. This is xenophobia, native, all these things, that for them, the hatred is actually visceral. It isn't intellectual, it's really visceral. And to that extent, I think the media will also continue that element. But what I'm really hoping is not to simply rely on how they're going to react, how the media is going to react, the mainstream media, but to what extent we can have more Joe Rogans, how can we have more podcasts, how can we cultivate new groups of influencers who are able to have an impact and create an alternative media that isn't just simply on the margins, but is actually having greater and greater hegemonic influence.
So you think essentially, I mean, you were sort of in on that track previously with that alternative media or so-called alternative media will outgrow the established media. Is that what you think will happen? Or is the stage is set for that, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a struggle. It's not going to just, you know, you can't just simply walk in there and take over, because these people have got, you know, billions of dollars. They have a tremendous amount of experience. They literally got, you know, the whole celebrity culture behind them. Every single important actor and actress, you know, I mean, the people, you know, singers and, you know, all these individuals that people love, you know, and millions of fans. You can't simply sidestep that overnight. But what you can do is you can create, you know, a situation where growing millions of people, if they want to get a news sense of what's really happening, if they want to listen to what's really happening and get what they think is the truth, are not going to go to the CBS or the NBC or the ABC in America, but they're going to sort of tune into a different kind of channel. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's the first time, certainly in my life, where I can see the possibility of the democratizing effect of an alternative media, because the technology is there. All we need is some good-looking announcers, some kind of charismatic people who can capture the imagination of the audience. And we need some politicians who are really flexible. They are able to have a sense of humor. They're able to become not just politicians, but real personalities that people can relate to.
But if you were to make some predictions, what do you think, for Europe, this is especially pertinent, what do you think will happen with Trump's threats regarding reducing his NATO engagement, for example? Like, is he going to leave NATO? Is he going to impose a lot of very harmful protectionistic tariffs on European goods traveling into the United States? What do you think will happen?
Difficult to say. I think in the military sphere, his main interest is not to leave NATO. I think his main interest is to basically ensure that a growing proportion of the costs of defense is put on the shoulders of European nations. so that America isn't paying as much money, spending as much as it's doing at the moment. That's the main thing that Trump is kind of concerned about. I think Trump is essentially not quite an isolationist, but he is very much against the idea that it's America's role to become the policeman of the world. So he will draw back in places, and he will always do what he thinks is the national interest of America. It's much more of it's got a much narrower focus on this matter than the neoconservatives had, or some of the more, in the past, some of the most liberal governments, the administrations had in the United States. So there are going to be some arguments on the defense front, particularly within NATO, and I'm fairly sure that he'll try to exert a degree of pressure on the Ukrainians, as well as on the Russians, to try to come to some kind of an agreement. I think that's probably, at least rhetorically outwardly, that's what he will try to do. He's not going to withdraw suddenly, and he's not going to change policy overnight, but the travel, the direction of his travel is in basically trying to kind of do what he can to kind of end the war or come to some kind of ceasefire. And I think he'll do the same thing in the Middle East as well.
Some pro-Trump commentators in Europe have actually said that maybe the Trump presidency will be bad for Europe short term, but it will be very positive long term. What do you make of that analysis?
You see, I think people imagine that it's individuals and individual administrators that decide some of the big global questions. You have to remember that regardless of who's the president of the United States, we're moving towards a trade war situation. I think there's a growing tendency towards protectionism in all the economies in the world. I think America is much more worried about the pressure that it's receiving from China and from Asia. So in terms of their economic calculations, that's the main focus. It's not Europe. Europe is also really important. But I think that it would have been just the same for Kamala Harris. They would have had to do whatever they could to secure the best possible deal for the United States. I think that the problem for Europe is that Europe's competitive position has severely diminished over the last decade, maybe even longer than that. It's got very low levels of productivity in comparison to other societies. And it's not investing in itself. It's not making any serious investment in new technology, all these important sort of technologies that are going to be important for the future. So what I would suggest is that whatever Trump does, whatever the Americans do, Europe needs to look to itself and see what it can do to revitalize its technological and industrial base. And I think that's a huge problem. It's a problem for Sweden. It's a problem for Germany. I mean, all of our more prosperous economies are really slowing down and lagging behind. And they're just basically asleep a little bit. And instead of being entrepreneurial and innovative, they're kind of tending to live off the past.
Thank you, Dr. Frank Furedi of the MCC Brussels think tank.
Pleasure. Nice talking to you.
And thank you for watching RIX Europe.